The Nowhere King is Centaurworld's most tragic character, and he slots very neatly into being the villain of the story. There is no world in which Horse and her friends can live peacefully without overcoming his fearsome hatred and the army of mutant abominations that he leads. Though his backstory is worthy of sympathy, the atrocities of war the Nowhere King brought to both sides of the rift are an irreconcilable evil, born from the worst traits of man and beast. And like all truly evil antagonists, he is pitiable in all the ways that he fails to be good. While I did have structural disagreements with the bulk of Centaurworld Season 2, the series finale, The Last Lullaby, managed to conclude both the Nowhere King plot and the core narrative in a way that I found immensely satisfying. If my last video gave the impression that I thought Season 2 was flat out bad, well, it's not that simple. In comparison to Season 1, it does feel undeniably weaker, but beyond the first couple episodes, the story really does pick up, especially when it recenters itself on Horse and the Nowhere King. I've seen several fans on social media say that Centaurworld Season 2 is a better time if you watch Season 1 and it together as two parts of one bigger season. It's similar to how Seasons 2 and 3 of She-Ra and the Princesses of Power feel uneven with a gap of months between them, but flow together naturally. I do plan a full rewatch of both seasons before committing to an analysis video of the whole series, so stay tuned for that in the near future. The purpose of this video is solely to focus on how the character of the Nowhere King was handled in the latter half of the story. And as such, this is your official spoiler warning before I dive into everything we know about this terrifying villain. So hush now, and watch all you little ones as we rush into the beginning, middle, and end of the Nowhere King. Though he is physically absent for most of Season 1, the reveal of the Nowhere King is foreshadowed by his iconically chilling lullaby that is employed throughout the herd's search for the shamans. The lyrics of this song alone tell us so much about why he is to be feared. First is the significance of nowhere, which we come to find out is the void inside of the rift. It's a lonely, empty place, lacking any of Centaurworld's colorful landscapes or even what little life remains in the world of humankind. It is as eerily silent as it should be, for a place where the singing and laughter have died. Another ominous lyric that spells danger because of just how much singing and laughter there is in this show. The concept of death is also subtly invoked in the references to darkness, dreamless sleep, and light leaving eyes. Beyond silence and death, the third literary motif in the Nowhere King song is a secretive feeling of hatred. What's no secret is how all these elements meld perfectly with the haunting, tinny music box accompaniment to create a feeling of deep distress in the listener. It presents everything we need to know about how the Nowhere King will threaten our heroes. He is a harbinger of death, a killer, who is brought joy by the act of ending lives. There is usually an implied mortal risk to fighting against most fantasy villains, especially monstrous and non-human ones like the Nowhere King, but to make one of his defining traits how much he likes murder is a bold and welcome decision. The amount of history we become privy to over the course of Season 1 only adds to the sense of dread that surrounds him. We saw entire villages destroyed by his army in both the human world and in Wamawink's backstory, and the miniatures on display in the Bear Tar's cave show that these weren't battles, they were one-sided massacres. This confirms that the Nowhere King isn't interested in fighting a fair or honest war, and that the suffering he causes might itself be his goal. When he finally shows up in Episode 10, there's little else he seems to want besides inflicting pain on others and escaping from his solitary prison in the Rift. That and his implied romantic interest in the mysterious woman, who served as a secondary antagonist and then as an ally in the ensuing battle. Thanks to her bringing the now complete key into the rift, and Rider and Horse working together, the Nowhere King is temporarily defeated and slinks off into the human world to take back command of his army. Going into Season 2, there were so many lingering questions about the Nowhere King, and everything I've said up until now is roughly all we knew about him. He was a mass murderer with a cool theme song and a past that begged to be explored. It's honestly a winning recipe for a final antagonist of any show, and Centaurworld Season 2 delivers on this potential from the get-go, even in ways that don't become clear until you've watched the entire thing. Much like in Season 1, the creators knew that a villain as game-changing as the Nowhere King needs to appear sparingly so that the audience never feels comfortable with his presence. For another great example of this, think of Bill Cipher in Gravity Falls. He only appears in a handful of episodes across the whole series, and in every one of those appearances, Bill does something memorably evil. When the one-eyed demon isn't using his nightmare powers to advance his goals, he's manipulating others to do his bidding through conversation. The same thing is happening with the Nowhere King, albeit in a more subtle way. We'll unpack that more later on, but not before we expand on this Bill Cipher comparison. Fans of the channel might know that our biggest video to date was actually about the Devilish Dorito, written by my fellow professional writer, Henry Galley. In that video, Henry explained how even though Bill is both literally and figuratively one-dimensional, he so firmly embodies the worst trait of the protagonists that they are forced to change in order to defeat him. Having this approach to a main villain meshes well with Gravity Falls' theme of friendship between siblings and the sacrifices we must make for the ones we love. Bill Cipher acts as a sounding board for these ideas to bounce off of, but we never get the sense that he's self-aware enough to realize where his blind spots are. Regardless, he never stops being fun to watch because the show goes out of its way to make him as heightened as possible. His screeching vocal performance by showrunner Alex Hirsch adds to how alien he feels in comparison to the rest of the cast, and this allows his scenes to slap the viewer silly. There's a reason Bill Cipher is often paired in dialogue with logical, orderly planners like Dipper, Ford, and Gideon, because the resistance that kind of personality offers is a filter to protect the audience from psychic damage. I know there are some people out there who might say that Bill Cipher doesn't need other characters to filter his intensity, and that there should be way more of him in the canon of Western cartoons. And respectfully, I think they miss the intricacies of what made him such a great villain in the first place. His chaotic mannerisms and trickster god nature only have narrative utility when they are balanced out by a tone of slow burn mystery and grounded emotional stakes. You can't have the paranormal or supernatural without some idea what normal and natural looks like. Bill Cipher is a disruption of that, an attack on sanity and stability. Likewise, if nothing better represents Centaurworld than a colorful collection of singing, dancing magic beings, and the Nowhere King represents where the singing and laughter will die, he is positioned perfectly as the vile villain to this saccharine show. It's the same refreshing contrast of tones that made Toffee from Star vs. the Forces of Evil work so well. Even people who didn't care for the later seasons could probably agree that he was the show's most compelling villain. The way he spoke and acted concisely and with little emotion was the antithesis of the hyperactive randomness of Star and her companions, and that always read as him knowing something that the protagonist and the audience didn't. He also became a bunch of slime at one point, just like the Nowhere King. More villains should do that, honestly. Speaking of, there's a lot of distressing anatomical details to love about the Nowhere King's horrifying creature design and personality. From his rack of melted fused antlers, to his spined eel-like tail, to the white elk skull that stands out so clearly from the rest of his melancholic mass. His first nominal appearance in Season 2 stretches these features in a disturbing new direction, as he devours one of his own soldiers alive a la No-Face from Miyazaki's Spirited Away. And as later revelations in his backstory would show us, the king shares the same gluttonous, borderline metaphysical hunger as No-Face. We also catch him retching and spewing out black goop, which either tells us he's still wounded from Ryder's attack in the Season 1 finale, or that, being whatever he is, causes profound unwellness. In either case, we're shown that this being responsible for so much suffering also suffers himself. And not in a I wanna hug him kind of way, it's more like the feeling I got watching that bear in Annihilation. That thing is sick and I don't want it near me. Episode 6 ends with the Nowhere King preparing to assemble his Minotaurs and storm the Rift, which we see come to fruition in Episode 7. Gotta say, he works a lot faster at raising an army than Horse does, but I suppose it helps that he already had one to begin with. What the Nowhere King doesn't have that Horse does is her straightforwardly named backstory magic, which he uses to hold him at bay after gambling everything on a desperate charge. He definitely remembered her from the Rift, but what he never could have expected was that Horse would be able to leap into his brain. Her spell doesn't vanquish the Nowhere King, but it opens his heart and his mind, and that is the key. Up until this moment in the story, the Nowhere King has been nothing if not a convincingly intimidating boss battle for the good guys to overcome. He has easily survived against the most powerful magic users in the setting, his Minotaurs and Super Beasts alone can tear through legions of Centaurs, and even the unknowable powers of the Rift Key couldn't keep him down for long. As the Last Lullaby begins, the time has come for Centaurworld to deliver on the rest of his potential. Who is he, and why did he become the thing he is today? The answers, of course, lie in his backstory, which is told non-chronologically over the course of the finale. I appreciated this choice from the writers, since it gave them the freedom to reveal information about the Nowhere King in whichever order had the strongest emotional arc. And, boy howdy, are the beats of that arc weapons grade. Let's start with the knowledge that the Nowhere King was once an elk, making him and Horse the only two completely animal characters in the show. And that is only the beginning of the parallels they share. Both have a strong attachment to a specific human, which has seemingly been challenged by the presence of a more compatible rival. Becky Apples in Horse's case, and in Elk's case, the General. While Becky is no replacement for Horse in Ryder's eyes, Horse becomes jealous and projects her feelings of inadequacy onto her. Horse views Becky Apples as a better, more desirable version of herself who has the attention of the person that she cares most about. In the song that shares her name, Becky Apples is compared to Jeffica, a character who Wamawink has similar feelings towards. In both Horse and Wamawink's case, the rivalry is a product of their imagination, and other factors are what strain these relationships. In Horse's case especially, because there is no affection at all between Ryder and Becky Apples. But if there was, and she wasn't projecting, she'd be in Elk's exact situation. The General truly is the man that Elk could have been, and is living the life that he still feels entitled to. Such are the consequences of a decision that both he and the General made together, but at the same time, didn't. Because before there was the Nowhere King, before there was Elk or the General, there was Elktor, the Rift Worker, who wanted to keep the worlds entwined, but couldn't do the same for his fractured self-identity. Love ended up being his best excuse to change himself, for better or worse. The General the better, and Elk the worse. Even in his original Elktor form, the Nowhere King still has parallels to Horse that go deeper than having similar relationships. Elktor struggles to feel comfortable in Centaurworld, much like Horse throughout the show. Though instead of learning to adapt and becoming better to himself like Horse does, Elktor is obsessed with being taken seriously. The third piece in his musical suite has him sing about wanting to be human and leaving only one pair of footsteps behind, while he watches a man play fetch with his dog on the beach. What's clear between the lyrics and the visuals is that Elktor completely disregards the dog, merely seeing the human as aspirational while dismissing man's best friend. In truth, there are multiple sets of footprints on that beach, and Elktor sees the four-legged tracks as beneath his notice. This attitude carries over to his human side, the General, whose earlier scenes in Season 2 read very differently when you know his origin. He is shown caring for Becky Apples, but in a patronizing way, which is conditional on her battlefield success. He's far more openly condescending towards Horse when they interact in the finale, seeming to mock her after she takes a fall on the battlefield. He also repeatedly belittles and mistreats his animal half throughout the backstory segments they share, even though Elk and him used to be the same. When talking with Ryder at the start of Episode 6, the General makes it clear that he'd rather retreat than face the Nowhere King, and even says that while she may trust the centaurs, he, quote, knows his enemies better than he knows his allies, unquote. While this does hint at a connection between himself and the Nowhere King, it also shows how little faith he has in centaurs. He can't bring himself to take them seriously, because that would cause him to doubt the necessity of Elktor's actions. The General owes his existence to ego death, but at the same time, the process that set him free ultimately led to the birth of the Nowhere King. That separate, tortured existence is partially the result of choices he made in the ideal human form that his progenitor desperately wished to obtain. All of the General's appearances before the reveal demonstrate the character traits that would come from that kind of backstory. He pulls a cheap power play on Ryder when they meet, just to watch her squirm as she tries to flatter him. He also talks big about how much he values humans, but saving their world doesn't seem to matter to him as much as escaping from the Nowhere King. At every turn, Ryder needs to prove something to him, or convince him to do something that a responsible person with his level of knowledge would already be doing. This effectively makes him the secondary antagonist of Season 2, similar to how Mysterious Woman was used in Season 1, and all of this comes full circle in the finale. It's worth considering that the first thing we learned about the General back in Season 1 was that he sent Ryder and Horse to retrieve the artifact, and that piece of the key ended up sending Horse to Centaurworld. This is just speculation, but it's possible that he wanted to use it for himself to go to Centaurworld and find his love interest, bypassing a confrontation with the monster that his other half became. He does say in Season 2 that the hope of magic in the universe is what kept him going all these years. And what did Elktor think was a better use for magic than being with the person he wanted? While the General is not the Nowhere King, he is still a cowardly and selfish character who has effectively been living a lie, using his status and war tactics to earn the approval of humans to play out an endless fantasy as a serious man. Of course, if the audience were told any of this before going into the finale, he couldn't perform his role as a foil to Ryder this season. He's a false hero in contrast to her, the genuine hero, and their dynamic adds much needed depth to the human side of the story. This is why I was understandably a little confused when I saw that another content creator's most substantive critique of Centaurworld Season 2 was that the General's story was rushed, citing the General's battle song as proof that the writers were trying to forge a connection between him and Ryder last minute. A connection which, from my perspective, feels like it already existed. Though he doesn't appear in Season 1, it's incredibly obvious how much respect Ryder has for the General, or at least that idea of him. She practically falls over himself when she has her first real conversation with him, and that's not generally how a confident and poised character like her behaves around others. And as I mentioned before, she spends the entire season earning his favor through drastic measures. A lot of this is more apparent on the rewatch, but it's frankly hard to miss if you're paying attention. The General's battle song isn't intended to make us suddenly fall in love with the guy, it's to showcase beautiful animation and fight choreography while the tide of battle turns back in the hero's favor. Hot on the heels of the utter smackdown the Super Beasts were giving to the Centaurs, and sandwiched between grisly backstory reveals, the battle song serves to reintroduce hope into the scenario, while also giving the human army that had been built up throughout Ryder's subplot a chance to shine. The reason it would appear not to function as a setup is because it's aggressively a payoff. But that doesn't mean that the song adds nothing to the General's character. It reinforces how much of the human side of Elktor has committed to his persona, and also ends with a chilling recognition of his mirrored existence to the Nowhere King. Itself a seamless transition into the final backstory sequence, which reveals the moment where his and Elk's relationship was beyond salvaging. This sequence rewards our patience by recontextualizing previous memories, and rewards our curiosity by finally showing in gruesome detail how Elktor's lesser-loved half went from a mere animal to the abomination that is the Nowhere King. Once again, and for the last time, there are juicy parallels to the journey that Horse has been on throughout both seasons of Centaurworld, and they're shown symbolically with the bodily transformation both characters undergo. As many readings of Season 1 have pointed out, Horse's change of art style represents self-discovery, as she realizes she belongs in Centaurworld with the herd. Her initial reluctance stems from a fear that she'll lose her connection with her closest family, Ryder, and that she'll have to abandon her existing self-identity as a serious, hardened warrior. Elk, on the other hand, is absolutely losing himself in the notion that he doesn't belong anywhere, and builds a new family of Minotaurs by force, which he uses to terrorize both worlds until he, too, is finally taken seriously. The Nowhere King is a manifestation of Elk's now limitless hatred, for the centaur he was, for the human he wanted to be, and for anyone else who belongs in either world. It's the inverse of how Horse overcame her inner demons to become who she is, even down to the ease with which he resigned himself to a life of suffering. Elk was able to point out to his counterpart that their former self didn't even try when it came to getting the girl, but the personal issues that influenced that decision still exist in him as much as they do in the General. And while the General has the luxury of denying his past because he got the better end of the deal, Elk is the very embodiment of Elktar's self-loathing. And once he gave in to that, all that was left was becoming the monster he always thought that piece of him was. Elktor's lasting legacy was externalizing the battle within his own psyche into a real war that did untold harm to both sides of the rift, and led to the worlds being cut off from each other. In doing so, he failed at his main objective as a rift worker, using the key to tear his own soul in two over the very woman who warned him that he should respect the balance of each side. Instead of listening to a single word she said, his human half lied and manipulated her for years, while his animal half grew into the Nowhere King. The blame for every human and centaur casualty of the Nowhere King rests on Elktor in the totality of his actions, not that he remained himself long enough to feel any remorse for the damage his obsessions caused. And that's why, even more so than the animal or human halves, the Nowhere King is Elktor's truest self, a tragic being that can only suffer and cause suffering. This is why Horse's escape from his mind marks the natural end of her character development, where she boldly declares that she belongs with her friends. She's learned what love and self-care can do, and how it can open new doors and make any world, no matter how strange, feel like a better place. Horse was able to reach this point in her arc because she needed to, in order to keep going. Her alternative, as we saw in the darkest episode of Season 1, is not entirely different from what happened to the Nowhere King at several key points in his broken existence. Horse was the one who was tested the most, and changed the most from beginning of the story to its end. She succeeded where the Nowhere King could not, and of all of the mirrors he had to compare himself to, it was Horse that proved that she was the hero to his villain. And that is what makes him the perfect villain for Centaurworld, a funny cartoon musical about learning self-acceptance and finding hope in unexpected places. It's a show where a jittery, scratchy-voiced deer wife can help a bunch of buff Arctic creatures deal with anxiety, where a quirky himbo giraffe can break the cycle of abuse and become a good dad, and where a pink fluffball of love can snap her best friend out of a depressive episode with a heartfelt song. It's a show about how important it is to find ways to be comfortable. And through the backstory magic of the Nowhere King, Centaurworld is also allowed to be a show about what happens when someone decides they can never be comfortable. I know that a lot of people might have seen the title of this video and expected me to be more negative on Centaurworld throughout it, but contrary to what the internet might have you believe, flawed does not equal bad, or even that I didn't like it. As a matter of fact, Horse uses that very word to describe herself, even after she has completed her journey. When I say that Centaurworld is flawed, that's a term of endearment. It takes courage and perspective to recognize flaws, and more importantly, to see past them. In the grand scheme of things, a flawed story is 1,000 times better than a story that's never been told, because every work of art has something meaningful to teach us, and Centaurworld has taught me a lot. Making this video even made me realize that many of my problems with Season 2 were knee-jerk reactions based on unreasonable expectations. Go figure. It sure is a good thing that I'm the only one on YouTube who is that short-sighted. As I said at the start of this video, I'm planning to do an analysis of the entire series after a full rewatch, and if that's something you'd like to see, then hit that notification bell and subscribe to the Dire Gentleman channel while you're at it. In the meantime, if you're hungry for more wholesome comedy mixed with existential horror, you should absolutely check out Less's Morgue, the ghostly and ghoulish podcast that I helped to create with some of the best and most talented people I know. Lastly, I've got a Patreon where you can listen to myself and those very same people review movies and discuss other topics too weird for YouTube. Links are in the description. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll be seeing you in the near future.